lot of times we take things for granted, having lived in this country, with freedom and freedom of expression and ideas and political views and the ability to make decisions about our lives and our professions. And that's something that I think is important for a lot of kids to understand, that not everybody had that opportunity or has that opportunity.
Welcome, friends, to another episode of the Immigrant Experience in America. As the Immigrant Experience in America, we explore the stories behind migration, not just the politics, but the human moments that shape identity, memory, and family. Today's conversation centers on immigration through the eyes of a child. What's lost, what's carried, and what shapes us long after we arrive. Today's guest is Dr. Sam Rodriguez Morheim, a proud Brooklyn native raised in Canarsie by Cuban immigrant parents who left their homeland in pursuit of freedom and opportunity. Dr. Morheim is a respected periodontist, a devoted father and grandfather, and the author of the children's book, Where Are All My Toys?
Yes.
Inspired by his family's departure from Cuba and his younger brother Jimmy's childhood experience of migration. Grounded in values of family, resilience, education, and service, Dr. Morheim's work reminds us that immigration isn't just a political event, it's a deeply emotional one, especially for children who don't yet have the language to understand what's happening around them. Welcome, Dr. Sam.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And that was a very nice introduction. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure. So tell us, you grew up in Brooklyn, but your family story began in Cuba. Can you take us back to that moment, whatever you know about why your parents made that decision to leave Cuba?
Well, of course, I hear it through family members. My father, unfortunately, is no longer alive. He died of pancreatic cancer in 1982. And right now, all the information I get, other than, general family members, is my mother, who's still alive. She's 96, and she has a better mind than most 20-year-olds. So I get very detailed information from her. My brother, of course, who is the protagonist of the book, and everything is through his eyes. He's 8 years older than me. I get a lot of information from him, from what he can remember. But going back to that era, 1962, when they decided to leave, that's when Castro came into power. And in short, they initially were happy with what they were hearing when he took over Cuba, and then things started to change very drastically. And what really triggered my father to decide to leave and leave everything behind was the fact that they were militarizing all the young kids. They weren't giving options. Kids were going to be marching through the streets holding guns or rifles. And my father said, there's no way I'm going to allow my son to go through that without having to make the decision himself. If I want to be in the Army, I could decide whether I want to or not, but not a child. So, they left in haste, left everything behind in pursuit of a different lifestyle. And when I say they left everything behind, they left their house, they left their cars, they left their professions and family members. And there was a trend of this happening. They don't have any regrets. I could tell you that when they decided to do this, it was a very well thought out decision, and many family members followed. And we settled in Brooklyn, and then our lives began there again. That's where I was born. So I was born two years after they left. And that's really what the book is about. The book is about my brother's perspective as a 5-year-old going through this, having his entire life go upside down. And, it's funny because when I talk to him about it, he now gets how important that was and what the impact was. But throughout his life, he really didn't think much of it. And, he'll say to me now, apparently it was a very important event. It shaped us. I think a lot of times we take things for granted, having lived in this country, with freedom and freedom of expression and ideas and political views and the ability to make decisions about our lives and our professions. And that's something that I think is important for a lot of kids to understand, that not everybody had that opportunity or has that opportunity.
Very true. Very true. I have wanted to welcome somebody from that Cuban era on the podcast for so long. So I'm so glad that you all reached out. Perfect story. And so I forgive me if I missed, if you gave the time period there. Was this 50s and the 60s, 50s and 60s?
Yeah, so it was 1962 when they decided to leave. And Fidel Castro was in power a couple of years already. It was after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So there was a lot of political upheaval going on. And communism was setting in very strongly, where education systems were infiltrated, businesses were infiltrated. There were so many stories that my family told me about what it was like to grow up in that sort of environment and not always have it. They were initially very happy. Cuba was a beautiful place. It's known for its beaches and nightlife and food, of course, and everything changed. When I think about how differently my life would have been, because it was just that decision that allowed me to grow up in the United States. I may have not even been brought up at all had my parents decided to stay in Cuba, or I would have grown up there in a communist regime.
Wow, so quite a big move for the family.
Yeah.
And there's so many stories. There's a lot of from what I know, Cuban Americans who live in Florida, in the Miami area. And
Yes.
when you come across, you hear stories of, my family left during this period. So it's really, really important for the story to be told. And we're so grateful that we're hearing yours today. So how did your parents talk, or maybe not talk, about the transition when you and your brother were young? Like, what stories were they telling?
They would basically ingrain in our heads that we needed to become professionals. And that was a commonality amongst Cubans that came over, because a lot of the people who had businesses lost their businesses, and if they were incredible business people, they would start up again here. And a lot of my mother's friends and my dad's friends were able to do that, but not everybody was. So if you were not a professional, okay, then it was up to you to start up a business again, or then decide to become a professional, meaning an accountant, a lawyer, a doctor. So in my family, you'll see a lot of doctors. And I often wondered why that was the case. And it was because it was ingrained in our heads that nobody can take that away from you, regardless of the political situation. So my brother became a dermatologist. I became a periodontist. And, there was definitely, it wasn't that they forced it upon us. They just said, you need education. Education's important. My father was an architect. My mother was a teacher. They continued their pursuit in education when they got to the United States. My mother then attained 2 more degrees. She got a degree in guidance counseling, a master's in psychology. So education was very important in my family. And my brother and I just happened to gravitate towards medicine because we were interested in that. That was the way we thought, and definitely don't have any regrets. And so they would talk to us about the importance of education, the importance of the family unit. What I remember growing up with was a lot of family members, cousins, uncles, aunts, all kind of together, because when they came over, they kind of congregated together, just like you see in Miami. I have lots of family there, family members that I haven't even met yet, are still there because they realized how important it was to stick together. And what was nice about that is you had extended modes of family members who are giving you advice. So it was like an extension of your immediate family. And you knew that there were other people who cared about you as well. As a kid growing up, I thought it was normal. Friends of mine who are American would come over my house, and there'd be 20, 30 people congregated, watching television, cooking, playing dominoes or cards. And my friends would say, "What's going on here?" And I'd say, "Nothing. It's Friday night. This is the way it was." And, I was very grateful for that. So having that, family experience allowed me to do the same thing for my own kids. And I think my kids now, being older, realize how great that is and how unique that is.
It is. It's very, I want to say a lot of immigrant groups, when they find each other, people from their country gravitate and they create a certain type of similar community. I've heard about it. I'm also from your neighbor across the way from Jamaica, right? And
Ah,
I've heard in New York area, like a lot of people from different Caribbean islands coming together and creating such groups. They get together, they play dominoes. There's a lot of cooking, and their kids just all are raised in that community of safety where they have trusted people. And it's the immigrant mentality, and it's coming from collectivist cultural backgrounds where we know the importance of having trusted people around your children, and it fills everybody up. Everybody's cup gets filled. We share everything, sometimes a little too much,
yes,
in
sometimes
the
a little too
middle,
much. But
in
you
the middle
start
of all.
gravitating towards meeting people who have similar backgrounds and similar experiences with their families. One of my closest friends is Jamaican, and he and his wife have a similar family unit. You start to realize what's really important, and that it remains till today. For me, it's always family and friends. And when I say friends, not just acquaintances, because we have a lot of acquaintances in our lives, but friends, people who are essentially family members. And I've nurtured those relationships over the years. I still have my closest friends who are from junior high school. I have my high school friends. I have my college friends. And while we don't see each other that much, we definitely communicate. And even if we don't communicate that much, that bond is still there, that they know that if they needed me, all they would have to do is reach out, even if they didn't speak to me for 6 months, that I would be there as a friend. So I'm very grateful for the background. And while it was difficult for my parents to transition, you have to go through things sometimes to realize and appreciate things. Just like when my father died, you have to rationalize it somehow, because we don't have the answers, obviously, and I'm not in search of the why anymore. I look at it and say, okay, what good can come of this? You have to sort of make sense of it. You have to, otherwise you go crazy. You have to, know that there was a purpose to it. And, I certainly would not want to disappoint him after he changes his entire life to make mine better. So I'll never forget that.
Right. Oh my goodness. Yeah, I think, certainly I can say people in the Gen X, maybe millennial generation, and those and boomers. Would you be considered a boomer?
Boomer.
Exactly. I think our parents pass on a lot of those value systems to us. I'm not quite sure about the younger generation. Things have changed. I've noticed a lot of changes, but yeah, you're expressing a lot of that immigrant mentality. And how interesting that you were born in Brooklyn 2 years after they arrived, but it's as if you were raised in Cuba.
Yes, yes, it's true. And, being in that environment, and I wrote this book for that reason, but I also have two other books. It's kind of a trilogy. One is also recently published, and the other one's coming out soon. And it all circles around growing up in Brooklyn. And why that's so important to me is that socioeconomically, it seemed to me that everybody was kind of on the same level. And while we were all from different backgrounds, there were Italians, there were Afro-Americans, there were Asians, there were Irish, there were Jews, there were Italians. We all managed to get along together. We lived in this microcosm of society, and it was very simple, a simple way of life. When I reflect on it, I feel so lucky that I talk about it in my second book. That's really what the second book is about. It's still titled "Where Are All My Toys?" but it's about a Cuban boy growing up in Brooklyn. That's the subtitle. And it's about how much fun it was and what it was like to establish these relationships and play games that were inherent to Brooklyn. It was a really unique way to grow up, and I'm very grateful for it. I wouldn't trade it for anything. It shaped who I am today.
Wow, wow. Beautiful, beautiful. So, what do you think children feel during the immigration process that adults often overlook?
I think we internalize a lot of things, and going back to what it was like to grow up in that area versus today, because the kids are different today. I think they're a lot more coddled. And the reason why my brother looks at it now and says, wow, maybe it was a bigger deal than I thought it was because my parents, just like other parents along that time, they were trying to get things together to make sure the family was going to be okay. They weren't, maybe diving into too much about how it affected my brother so much because of their upbringing. Kids were tougher back then. We were resilient. Now I feel that a lot of kids are coddled, and sometimes we pray too much into that. My kids know, like, I'm a no nonsense kind of guy. I'm very straightforward. My attitude is I don't want to hear any excuses. Look at everything that I've gone through. I've told you what I've gone through. Don't make an excuse for things that don't work out. Do something about it, move forward. So I think that kids today look for answers sometimes, and there's so much information out there, and then they get sucked in and manipulated by so many things when the answer is right in front of them. Talk to the people that love you, the parents, grandparents. You could learn so much from them, and these are people who are going to guide you based on their experiences.
Definitely. That's why it's so important to have that multi-generational family setting. And unfortunately, because of the global economy, a lot of times, a lot of us, my generation, we go where the work is and it takes us out of our communities, and we don't have grandma down the street, uncles and aunties a few doors down, and the community that, for example, I feel like I was raised in. But our little one is being raised in a completely different setting. She doesn't necessarily go outside and play in the neighborhood just because we have so many different people and not everybody's as welcoming and everything. And so it really pains me at times to see that she's growing up in such a different setting. And I wonder, how will this impact her? What is her view of the world as she grows up? And
That's
so,
exactly the point. That's exactly the point, that I happened to grow up in a much simpler environment. And yes, I think it is harder on kids to some degree. And they're searching in the wrong places sometimes. And they're getting influenced by people who aren't necessarily looking after their, best, that are looking after their well-being the way their own family members should. And it is tougher on parents today too. It was simpler back then in the sense that I remember sitting down for dinner with my parents, and every night we had to be home at a certain time, and we would have conversations. There were no cell phones. There was none of these distractions that we have today. And that's a big problem. And, you can go on and on about that, but it's got to be controlled. And it starts with the family. That's where it starts. All these crazy things that happen today. My answer to that, and I'm simplifying it a bit, is it's right in the family. That's where it starts. Okay, you have to have conversations. Some of them are tough conversations. I didn't understand everything my father was trying to tell me when I was younger, but it's a grooming process. And then you start learning, oh, that's what he meant. Maybe that's what that was. And then you start formulating your own ideas. But the foundation of who I am is based upon my heritage and how important that was. Growing up in a place like Brooklyn with so many different types of people around, yes, it was simpler because we didn't have all these other distractions. For me, it was playing, riding my bike, not worrying too much about how far I went on my bicycle. Of course, that's different today. If I had to get home, we didn't have cell phones. Nobody was texting us. We just knew, like, if the sun was coming down, or we asked a neighbor, what time is it? We knew we had to be back at a certain time. We played in the street together, and things have changed quite a bit. Not for the good.
Yes. Sadly so, right? The
Yeah.
exposure to social media and all of the downsides that come to that. Security of children, because there's so many incidents that have happened and people are just afraid, and legitimately so, wanting to
Yes.
protect your children and not knowing who you can trust. Your neighbor across the street, you don't, sometimes you don't even know who they are. And
Yes.
so it's a different world. It really is. But I think we do have some leverage to try to create that sort of community, if we can, for the next generation. I think it's really vital for their identity, for their sense of belonging, and passing on a lot of the multi-generational value system that we got from the previous generation.
My mother's in an assisted living facility, and it's the type of facility where you have very high functioning individuals who, when I go to visit her, a group of them addressed me one time and said, your generation should come in here more often and take some advice from us. And I said, wow, what a great idea. But nobody does it. We can learn so much from the older generations. And yes, I think that part of it is, and you mentioned this generation, which is a tough one. They don't feel that we understand them. And that's the problem. And I'm trying to say to them, yeah, we may not have experienced or listened to the same music or had the same experiences that you do, but we went through a childhood and we felt the way you did in terms of uncertainty. So we kind of get it. Yes, we went through different things, but the values are still there. That's what you can learn. And I just think it's sad that we're not taking so much advice from so many people who have so much more experience than we do. And I myself didn't reach out enough to individuals that I could have, or I thought I knew better. And that's what it's all about, learning and just giving information to people. And wherever I can, I give advice. I still take advice, and you got to keep an open mind.
Definitely. And it's a work in progress, especially
Yeah.
for our generation, dealing with our next generation, trying to make sure we create that community and pass on some of our values to them, because there's so much influencing them these days. So the title of the book is such a where are all my toys? It's such a powerful question. What does it represent emotionally?
So, where are all my toys has to do with the fact that when my brother left, he just finished receiving all these toys. The one thing in the book I will say that is not really true is that I started off with my brother's birthday party because it was just easier to understand than an event called the Three Kings, which happened in Cuba, where there was a celebration and kids received toys. So putting that aside, he receives all these toys. Now my parents are saying, okay, we're going to take a small trip, and they're not really telling him what's going on. So he brings a couple of his favorite toys, and then when he gets to the airport in Cuba, the immigration officers take his toys away, and he doesn't understand why. So from that moment on, my brother is wondering, like, what happened to my toys? Where are my toys? And the impact of that, because he really didn't understand what was happening, is that when he then, and I address this in the book, when they get to the United States and they're finally settled in, and he's getting to know friends and in the neighborhood, he goes out and starts taking all the toys that were left by his friends outside, and he hides them under his bed, thinking that they're going to be taken. And my mother goes up to him and says, what is this? And he says, well, I don't want anyone to take my toys. And she says, that's not going to happen here. That's different. We're in the United States. That's not going to happen. So you don't need to worry about that anymore. And to me, that was a huge awakening for my brother to understand that, like, think about the uncertainty that he had. And there was one particular toy called Piggy Cook, which he held close, and he to this day says that was a great toy. I can't believe it's missing. And if you go on eBay now and you get it in perfect condition, it's $750. Yeah, unless you want a broken one, you could get it for about $100. I was going to get it for him, and I said, yeah, I'm not spending $750 no matter how much I love him.
Wow, that's expensive. Wow, from back in the day. I guess it's vintage.
Vintage, yes. It was a little chef that would flip pancakes or something like that. It was a cute little toy. A lot of them are coming back, those nostalgic toys, like the Easy Bake Oven. They're going to be there forever. Light Bright. And when you think back as a kid, you had favorite toys. Mine was a big wheel. I addressed that in my second book. All part of the growing up as a kid. We all reflect on those times.
Right. So I think you mentioned, or I read somewhere, that your brother was pretty young. I think maybe around 5 when they left. So why did you choose to tell the story through his eyes?
What a better way to do it than through the eyes of a child, because so much is misunderstood. Even my own brother now realizes, after there was so much publicity about my book, realizing, wow, that was a major event in my life. So there are so many other kids going through similar situations, and I wanted to let them know you're not alone. And you may have a different story, but those feelings are very similar, and there's always a happy ending that follows. And I've been told that now by a lot of people. The book's been criticized quite a bit, which is fine, because it deals with some serious issues. And I said, you know what? I'm not going to tell a story like that. I don't have to get into details about how bad things were, but I could get the general gist of it out and just get the point across that, hey, this kid went through something pretty major. He had to leave his homeland, leave his toys, and now be in a different country where they speak a different language, and he's thrown into a situation that he has to now, understand and acclimate to. And that's a tough thing for a child to go through. And what saved my brother in particular was his ability to draw. He was an artist. He just had this incredible talent, and that's how he got back to who he was and started making friends and fitting in. So there's this silver lining that I talk about. You have to find your silver lining, and it's in all of us. It's a matter of you having to find it. And I can't tell you what it's going to be, but I could tell you it's there. So I'm a very positive person, obviously. And, I always look like there's a reason why things happen, and God only knows. And we need to just move forward and figure it out and find our path. So I think telling it through the eyes of a child is important, because I want to let other kids know it's going to be okay.
Yes, yes. So how do you think children process loss differently when they don't yet have the language or context to relate?
They internalize it, and they start, it starts manifesting in their actions. And that's why it's so important for parents to be on top of their kids and really get into their heads and understand what's going on, who their friends are, all the sayings that we grew up knowing. Like my parents would say, and they would tell to me in Spanish, they would say, listen, tell me who your friends are and I'll tell you who you are. I think that kids internalize a lot of these things, and they need to be able to speak to someone. And if they can't speak to their parents, they're going to speak to their friends, or they're going to gravitate towards friends that will accept them. And that could be good and bad. It's not easy. As you know, if you have kids, there's no rule books, and all kids are different. But one thing is for certain is if you go back to your core values and what your parents taught you, as much as you hated it when you were growing up, you realize that you become your parents, and there was a reason why they said certain things. You start to realize that's what keeps things together. Just going back to those basic core values of family, of trust, things like that.
Very good, very good. What do you think immigrant parents underestimate about how much children remember? So a lot of times, you'll hear immigrant adult when they tell a story of them leaving home, wherever that is, when they were a certain age.
Mm-hmm.
And some say, after a certain age, they don't remember much. Others, and a lot of times I think immigrant parents are going through so much adjustment challenges that they don't realize how the impact of a move like that can really affect their children. So how do you think they may have immigrant parents may be underestimating the impact of a move like that on their child?
I think that they don't realize, because they're consumed by so many things like my parents were, and they're shaped by themselves growing up in an atmosphere that was a lot tougher. When I talked to my parents about, just my mother, about what she went through as a child, it doesn't compare to what I went through. I had it so much easier. It had nothing to do with the immigration. It just a tougher upbringing, because they had less and they learned how to deal with less. So then what happens is the parents assume the kids are going to just assimilate. They're going to adjust. And I think that maybe it's not so good all the time. I myself, as close as I was to my parents, my father was not one who revealed too much about his sensitivities or his idiosyncrasies or his faults. This is the way it is. This is what you have to do. And it worked, because I did need that heavy hand. I think that there's got to be a balance. So then what I took from that was, what? I'm not going to be as hard as my father, because I remember, and my brother felt the same way, that communication with dad, as short a time as we had him, was not great. We would turn to our mother, who was a much more sensitive person, when we needed to ask something more personal. There's no question that I knew that my father loved me, and he showed me in so many different ways. But I think that parents need to be understanding and try to have these conversations. Even if a child's not ready at a certain point, you got to keep trying, because they will internalize it, and somehow it's going to come out, and it may not come out in a positive way. And so we're so quick now to say, oh, put the kid into therapy or do this. And it's sitting right in front of you. You need to put the time in, have the conversations, make family time. And it is very difficult today to get everybody together. Look, I had my son recently visit me from Florida. He's almost 30 years old, my younger son. And I made it a point to just go out to dinner with him alone, without anybody else, so that we can open up to each other and start bonding again. So I think it's really important to stimulate conversation. You know, kids may not think that you care about talking about that, or they don't know how to present a conversation like that. And I think it's up to us to be able to stimulate that conversation.
That is such a good point you're making. I think a lot of times the culture is so different, from it's in the Caribbean and in other places. Parents, it's a lot about survival, taking care of family, taking care of community. And oftentimes they don't really have that luxury of time to really just be present with you as children, right?
Yes.
And I think a lot of immigrant children will probably say the same thing. Mom and dad were always working. They were always taking care of grandpa, grandma, and everybody else. And so it's important that you're expressing that have that awareness, how important it is to sit down with your children and be present with them and create that memory and bond with them. But it's not, I don't think that it's not that the other generation before us didn't want to. Perhaps they didn't have that full awareness about how important it was. They expressed themselves differently.
Yes.
And we have to, as children of immigrants, try to see the love in some of the things that were perhaps lacking, right? That are
Yes.
different from the American perspective.
Yes.
A lot of times we have, and then sometimes I think immigrant children, there's so much going on in that adjustment phase where we all don't have the words to even express what's going on. It's such a huge learning process. You mentioned that your brother couldn't speak English at first, right? And I'm sure you probably were using Spanish as well at home and had to also learn English outside of the home. But he later found expression in art. Why was that such a critical lifeline for your brother?
That was a big part of the transition for him when they finally settled in Brooklyn. And the teacher contacted my mother and said, look, he's having a hard time. He sits in the corner. He doesn't really associate with any of the other kids. And it's the language barrier that's the problem. So my brother grew up speaking Spanish, although my father said, in the house, we speak Spanish. In the street, you'll learn English, or at school, you'll learn English, which I'm grateful for because I'm fluent in Spanish now, right? But, and I think it's easier when both parents speak the same language, so that you get that in the house. But it was tough for my brother because he, didn't know how to communicate with the other kids. And then what happened was he would sit there, and either there was a drawing exercise or he just decided to do it himself. And he was an incredible artist. It was just a gift that God gave him. And we already knew that he had this. Well, I didn't, but my parents did, obviously. And all of a sudden, the kids were interested in what he was doing. So the teacher got a great idea. And she said, you know what? I'm going to really emphasize this. And we're going to do more art. And we're going to have Jimmy really be the leader here in doing this. And the teacher would speak kind of on his behalf. And they would do exercises. And my brother would go around and help the other students with their artwork and in expressing whatever they were expressing. And then he became the quote unquote ambassador of the class. Now, other immigrant students are starting to come into the school system, and now he's the teacher, and he feels more of like he found his role, his place, and that helped him. So that was his silver lining, having that gift. Not obviously not everybody has that, but there's always something in you that you may not realize may have a big impact on other people. And my brother continues, even though he became a dermatologist, art is a huge part of his life right now. He converted his garage to a studio a few years ago, and he's constantly making pieces of art, changing the way he does his art. He'll take old pieces of art and then redefine them, which is interesting. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, and it was even a surprise to me. I said, well, I thought you did that painting already. He said, I'm never done. And that was interesting because it's kind of like a musician taking a song that you know so well. The one that comes to mind is the Eagles, Hotel California. There are so many versions of that song by the same artist. Billy Joel does it a lot. They change the instrumentation. It's the same song, but it's varied because it's art. It's not just one thing. So it's an expression on so many different levels. So he was able to acclimate to the situation with the help of the teacher, which we were all grateful for, to express himself through art because he couldn't verbally.
Yes. I wonder if you know other stories of other immigrant children while you all were growing up, particularly because you're in Brooklyn, you're in New York. And do you see any parallels between your brothers healing through art and how many immigrant children today or back then cope silently?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, so many stories. We were very close with an Italian couple, and the son happened to be an incredible baseball player. And through sports, he was able to really reach for the stars. And he was drafted to professional teams as a result. And both parents were immigrant Italians who settled in Brooklyn just like we did. And those commonalities, brought us all together. Now, when you look back and you see all these kids that managed to excel with talents, and, if you're lucky enough to have a really good talent, you're going to do really well with it. What I love about it is that, it's always a reminder. You never forget where you came from, the simplicity of it all. And success, when I define success, really has very little to do with money. It's success in realizing that you have achieved certain ideas and creating your own family. When I look at my mother, if it wasn't for her, and I remind my kids when we're all together, if it wasn't for her, we wouldn't be sitting here. Like if she didn't make that move to come here, we wouldn't be sitting here. So never forget that. I know the grandkids will understand that too. And it's up to us to constantly reinforce that because it does get lost. It could start to fade away if we don't keep up those kinds of conversations. It's really important. I'm a true believer in that generational impact that we can have.
Right. So true. That generational transfer of information, oral.
Transfer of information.
Yes, yes. And the stories that they'll recall when they get to be older and have their families and things that they hold true to them. It's important that they hear it firsthand. That's so important. And she's 96? 96.
96. And with a mind of a 20-year-old. And, her salvation is gambling, believe it or not. My mother is an incredible poker player. She plays roulette. She plays craps. And that's her therapy. And she loves to go to the casino. And the best part of it is she wins all the time. I don't know how she does it, but she's always winning.
Keeps her mentally sharp. That's good that she has the outlet. And,
yes, that's what it is. That's what it is. It's that mental, it's the mathematics behind it. I think that's what keeps her going. She plays poker. She got other people in her assisted living facility interested in it, and they bought a poker table for all the people who were into that. And it was nice because they recognized that this was important.
Yes, yes, yes. Okay, so you initially thought about writing a novel, as I read before. What made you realize that the story belonged in a children's book?
I just wanted to be able to get it out there a lot quicker. And a novel just takes so much time. Not that, believe it or not, a children's book, this children's book took about a year to put together because it has to be concise. And there was a lot of editing. You had to make sure the illustrations fit the narrative. So it's not that it was simpler, it's just that it's a different approach. And I said, how am I going to get both parents and children involved? And I knew that if I did it this way, parents would read it to their children and you would hit both generations. And that's exactly what's happening. And I'm so thrilled about that. People who have read my book have I heard a great story recently. Somebody approached me and said, you know, my daughter's husband is a teacher in Boston, and he has been reading your book to the children of his class. And I just couldn't believe it. I said, how on earth would two people come together? I just happened to be talking about my book. And then I mentioned the title of the book, and she said, wait a second. And then she texted her son-in-law, and then he texted back a cover of my book and then explained that he was using my book as a method of teaching children about immigration because apparently his class was comprised of a lot of immigrants. And so I said, there it is. It's exactly what I wanted to happen. So that's why I did it, because I knew that adults would reach out to the children as opposed to doing it in a novel where only maybe adults would see something like this and then have to explain it or maybe never explain it to their children. I'm grateful for having the realization that that could have a bigger impact.
Yes. So I'm wondering, what was the hardest thing for you to put on the pages?
Wow. I wasn't ever asked that before. I would say that understanding that my father had to go through what he did for us, a better life. And when I speak to my brother about it now, it saddens me a little bit because my dad was a very stern, serious guy from the moment I met him, you know, and got to know him. And he was tough to crack, so to speak. It was really difficult to get into my father's head and really, you know, get close to him. And my brother said he wasn't always like that. He changed when he got to the United States. So I think the way I'm rationalizing this is that he felt a lot of pressure to keep his family going and to make sure that we were going to be okay. And it's incredible to me that he changed so drastically in terms of his personality, because think about it, he came here, even though he was a professional, he didn't speak the language, and he had the responsibility and the burden of making sure that his family was going to be okay, both emotionally and financially. And it changed him. And that was a difficult realization, knowing that he was actually incarcerated when he first got here because they wanted to, they meaning the immigration officers in the United States, wanted to make sure that he wasn't a communist and that he had the right motives for being here. And we kind of had to prove that. So I touch upon that a little bit in the book about the separation that my brother had to go through, not only with his toys, but with my father for a couple of months, not knowing if my father was going to come back. That was the toughest part, I would say.
Wow. And so many families are going through that in recent times. You've heard
Yes.
stories of people being separated for even longer periods of time. And
Yes.
even families who are refugee families who are separated from their countries for natural disasters, civil unrest, etc., and they get separated. And that's actually talking to part of that separation that happens during the transition and movement.
Yes, exactly. And there's so many stories. Writing books like this, talking about it, having discussions, having this wonderful podcast will hopefully enable people to open up about it. And telling your stories will help the other generations understand that you're not alone, and there's something that there's good that can come out of it. But it's not going to come out of it in any easy fashion. You have to put work into it. And I want to stress that there was nothing about this that made it easy. And as you get older, you realize, wow, now I'm beyond my father's age. And I can't believe that he went through what he went through at that age. And I was so lucky not to have those experiences. And he sacrificed himself so that I didn't have those experiences. And to me, that's what's important. We're going to make it easier for our generations, hopefully, but they should never forget the sacrifices that we went through in order for them to have a better life.
Oh, and I also want to underline that too. I came out with a book telling my family's immigration story as well. And part of my concern in a snippet of a conversation I had with my father is being so concerned that the next generation will not know the struggles that my dad's generation went through, the first person who arrived, and then siblings waiting 12 years to get here, and the first people who come, and the struggles that we go through to get to where we are today. These stories need to be told. And so I wonder what that does to you emotionally. And do you share that with your children and grandchildren about your father?
I share it with my two boys. My grandkids are still too young, but I instill it into my two boys because I want them to be able to have those conversations with their kids and explain what their great grandparents went through in order to give them the life that they have, that they should never take it for granted, that they should understand that things didn't have to be the way they are today, and it's because they made those hard decisions and cared enough for their future generations to be better off in a better place, that is something that should never be taken for granted. I think that's the ultimate goal, is to impart upon those important ideals in the next generations, however you get it across. And for me, it was easy to do it this way. I always had a knack for writing. I always had an interest in doing it. I always wanted to do this. I'm so happy that I made the small impact that I did so far. I'm grateful for all that, but it really stems from my parents and grandparents who, when I think back and go, wow, to think that somebody cared about you that much to change their lives for you to have a better life, what a concept.
Hmm. And it's so important that we as immigrant children get that we get it, that we take it to heart, and that they know that we understand. Because a lot of times we are concerned that the next generation are not able to make that, to connect the dots. They see the abundance, they see mom and dad going off to work and we can provide, but they lose that connection of what it was like before. And that gives us meaning to continue to strive to do better, to honor the past. And so that is so important. So I'm wondering, what message do you most want parents and children to take away from the story?
Well, I think I said it in so many different ways, but don't take anything for granted. Don't take what you have for granted. Things can change in an instant, and If they do, you will find it in yourself. You will find something in yourself to be able to persevere. There's always light at the end of the tunnel, and that you should realize that through hard work and determination and faith, you will advance. And whether it be professionally, personally, and unfortunately, you learn the most through adversity. And you hear so many people say that if I had not failed, I wouldn't have succeeded. You need to understand failure, however that is, on whatever level it is. Don't be scared of it. Embrace it and figure it out. And I think that that's what's important here. And I think that's what shaped me. How could I complain about anything? And why do I feel in any instant that I'm not able to get out of a certain situation if there's some adversity? I think that a good way to do it with kids is through sports or communal activities, and working with other kids their age. They figure things out. Sports is a great example. And my kids were into sports, but the kids who aren't into sports don't have to be into sports to learn these lessons. With sports, you could always revert back to, let's say, when your son was in baseball and he was pitching and he pitched to a batter and the batter hits a home run and the game's over and your son lost the game. Okay, obviously that kid is going to feel bad about that, but that doesn't mean that that's the end of the world. You forget about it and you move on, and that's part of life. And you figure it out. You figure out what you have to do next to maybe not end up in that situation. So there's so many different analogies that you could use, but I would say the most important thing that parents can teach their kids right now is, other than family foundation and not taking things for granted, is get involved in activities that you're interested in, where you can learn how to deal with situations that are real life situations, because they will present themselves on a smaller level, whether it be music, whether it be art, whether it be sports, whether it be joining activities in school. I think that's really, really important. And kids today who aren't doing that have too much time on their hands, and then they will seek out the wrong thing.
Yes. So how did writing this book change the way you see your own childhood, if it did?
It made me go back to details that I haven't thought of in a long time. And it made me realize how very lucky I was to grow up in an environment that, like I said, was a microcosm of society, but a very simplistic life, but with a lot of different types of people. And what I remember is that we didn't know any difference. I didn't know that my friend who is an Afro-American was different than me because he had a different color skin. I didn't know that my Italian friend ate differently or did things differently in their house. Everybody was kind of the same. And I felt very lucky understanding that, I grew up with so many different types of people, and we were able to coexist and still have fun together doing simple things. And when I reflect on my childhood, it makes me realize how very lucky I was to have such a strong foundation, develop these friendships from early on in the early stages of my life. It's incredible. And it shaped me. I'm very proud of the fact that I grew up in Brooklyn, a place like Brooklyn. All the games that I learned, street games, a very unique experience, very unique.
I recently interviewed someone from Long Island who moved back with his father after undergrad to Jamaica because his father was starting a hotel business. And I mean, I'm yet to meet a New Yorker who is not proud of being raised or growing up in New York. So I think you guys just, New York is such a, I don't even know what the
people
word
from
is,
New
but you guys
York,
are proud people.
yeah, we get a bad rap sometimes because we're so harsh, but it's because we're honest. And, it doesn't always come across the way you would like. But I'll tell you something about New Yorkers. They're the first to jump in when somebody else needs help. I was on the subway platform about a year ago near Tribeca, and a dog startled this woman and she fell back onto the train tracks. And, of course, a train started coming. Three people, she was about 100 feet away from me, and I was with a group of people, and we're flagging down the train to stop. And three people jumped onto the tracks to help her get back on, and she ended up being okay. And that's the kind of thing that I remember about New Yorkers and growing up. You always meet somebody from Brooklyn or from New York, and immediately we connect. And that's what's cool about it.
Hmm. So wondering if there's any part of the story that you intentionally left out and why. Is it for maybe it's for a future book or it was just way too
Well,
personal?
I left, that's great. I left out a lot of things because I didn't think it was appropriate for a children's book. And like I said, I was criticized even to this extent that some of the things were a little too intense, so to speak. Maybe one day they'll decide to make a mini series about it. That would be amazing. Everybody wants their book to turn into a movie or a series, but there were when the things that come to mind was things that happened to my father when he was in Cuba that was also propelled him to want to leave. So when Castro took over, initially everybody liked him because it sounded great, right? All these ideas of how government's going to change and you're going to get things for free and everything's going to be better. And then what happened was you started realizing that the government was infiltrating your personal life. And if you spoke against the government, they didn't take kindly upon that. So what happened to my father, and I don't know the specifics of it, but one day they came in, and this happened to a lot of his family members and friends, and they came in and they just took my father, and my mother didn't see him for over a week. And she didn't know what the circumstance was, why he was taken. He was questioned by militants in the government. And I think it had something to do with the fact that he started speaking against, he became a little political, and he started speaking against what was going on in the government. And that's another thing that we take for granted in this country. We're able to do that, right? And over there, if you did that, that's a big problem. And they took my father, apparently they roughed him up a bit. Happened a couple of times. Then he said, "This is no way to live." So that was one of the things that I left out. And when I think about that, I go, wow, it could very easily have been over and my mother would have never seen my father again. I would have never existed. So many things very easily could have happened that didn't. But that's one of the stories that I heard, which is why I think also his attitude changed quite a bit, because to go from nothing at all like that to having a beautiful life and with beautiful beaches in a beautiful country to being taken from your family so easily and then having to go to another country, I think will have an impact on your personality for sure.
Yes, right. And I think perhaps that generation, because they have so many responsibilities, they don't get the luxury of probably seeking therapy or having somebody create the space to say, what was it like for you? Like internally, how do you process it? Do you even have the words? You
There were
know,
no,
they
there was no therapy back then. There was no therapy, yeah. And I think, and even with my brother, I'm sure he needed, today he would have definitely been in therapy for losing his toys and for what he went through. There's no question about it. And he'll tell you, you know, why do you think I'm so messed up? It's okay, because the family foundation was still there. He understood that the basis for it was still about love, and you know, he has a very, very close relationship with my mother. So I think that regardless of not having therapy when he should have, I think he did okay. But you're right. They thought they dealt with things differently, good and bad. They dealt with it differently, and they
they,
figured it out.
and perhaps they didn't have a choice. They had to keep moving. They had to go to work. They had to provide. They had to be that strong tower for their children. And they oftentimes there's no space
There's no
for
space.
them to even to look within. They may even, look within and see that there's pain, but what space and luxury do they have to stop life and say, I gotta fix this? They just gotta keep moving. And so shout out to immigrant parents. We know the journey is seriously not easy. And we're so grateful. And sometimes it's not as easy for us as children to even tell our own personal parents, right? That's why this podcast exists, to have the conversations for us to sometimes say it out loud, because sometimes it's not always easy for us to tell them to their faces, and we show it differently, even because relationships aren't always the easiest. And so this podcast is a testament to the hard work that immigrant parents put in.
Absolutely. And that's why we immigrant children will relate to each other much better that way. And they should have these conversations. Don't stand shy of having these conversations, talk about it. And sometimes I myself won't have really meaningful conversations when I probably should have with other immigrant children, and just find out the stories and find out what their families went through. Even after doing this podcast, I'm going to open up to some friends of mine and dig a little deeper into their backgrounds, because it's important. It's important to understand and not forget what our families went through.
Yes, yes. So you alluded to earlier that there were some criticisms about the book and that it was
Hmm.
probably a little too, I don't know if you want to say harsh, or um, what are some stories that you're hearing after, just across the spectrum, that people are saying? What sort of conversations have been sparked? What's your potential hope for something like this?
Well, I think the criticisms may be a little justified, but it's also probably coming from people who didn't have those kinds of experiences, and they're looking for a children's book that is happy-go-lucky, and everything starts off good and ends up good, and you know this may not be the appropriate bedtime story to read every single night, but I will say this: it's always positive in the end. Every single one of my books has positivity in it, and there's always that notion that things are going to be okay. They may not start off that way, but I think that's a great lesson to be learned. And I've seen the conversations online about it where people have criticized it and said, that's not something that I want my kid to hear about or read about. And somebody else will respond, but this is what happens. This is reality. Why wouldn't you want that? So in other words, you want your kid to live in a bubble. So I think it's great that the conversations are occurring. I think it's great. I'm not angry that somebody felt that way, because I want to be able to say, well, listen, you may not want to read your kid this story, but this is reality for so many people, and you need to understand that it is a reality. Okay, and maybe you should be telling your child, hey, you're lucky that you didn't have to go through this. Okay, But I could tell you that the immigrant parents that have come up to me and have said, I read this over and over again to my kids, over and over again. And one of the super in my building who came from another country said, I always tell him, right or wrong, he says, if you don't behave, this is something that can happen to you. And all. I said, I don't know if I would say that. I actually told him, I said, you don't want to scare the child. You want him to realize that this is a reality that some kids have gone through. And you want the child who is born from immigrant parents to understand that they went through certain sacrifices. So I think stimulating the conversations are very good. I'm glad there's controversy. And I was very careful about not getting too intense, but I was also very careful about creating a positive ending to each of the books. And it is a trilogy, this Where Are All My Toys? And essentially it takes you from what happened in Cuba to Brooklyn, growing up in Brooklyn, and then what happened to my family and my brother and I as a result of all of that. And we did live happily ever after. And now the next generation starts. And I'm going to continue to write books about Brooklyn. The next one's going to be about my cousin, who was my best friend growing up in Brooklyn. And that one's going to be a tough one to write because he died of epilepsy. It was tough because we were 17 days apart and we literally grew up from day one together until the age of 49. And we were supposed to go to Cuba together in search of our family roots, and we never got to do that. So I'm going to be very careful about how I write this, but it's mostly going to be positive things about what it was like to grow up with him in Canarsie, Brooklyn. It always goes back to Brooklyn somehow.
Yes. Have you been back? Has your family been back?
They haven't. And when I've asked my mother about going back, she has no interest at all. She kind of feels like the country now has betrayed her, and she considers herself, even though her heritage is from that area in Cuba, she considers herself an American. She says, this country gave me everything that I have, and I am so grateful for it. There's nothing like this country. And not to get too political, but when she sees things that go on today, she's saddened because she realizes that there are generations that don't really understand that it's not so easy to be in other countries like it is over here. And you shouldn't take it for granted. And it really gets to her when she sees that. It gets to me too,
Yes. Only those of us who come from somewhere else can really get that story. And so I'm so glad that you're verbalizing it and telling the Cuban American story. We're so grateful. So is there anything that I have not asked, Dr. Sam, that you would like to say? I'll open the floor for anything I left out.
I appreciate that question. The way I want to leave this is that just because we're all from different generations doesn't mean that we can't have meaningful conversations where we can connect with one another. I think we can learn a lot from the older generations and the younger generations. I'm willing to learn from the younger generations too, so they should be willing to learn from us. And I just think that's what it is. That's what it's all about. Opening up conversations, getting people to think about their own situations and make sense of it. I want to say, just be productive no matter what you do. And if you go through life and live in a bubble and only impact yourself, you're missing the boat. You need to impact other people. There has to be some kind of impact on other individuals, and then I think you get it.
Very good. Very good. What a nice way to end our time together, Dr. Sam. I appreciate your authenticity and taking us deep, deep, deep into your family's journey from Cuba to the United States and beyond.
Thank you so much, Simone. It's been a pleasure. I think you're doing a great thing here, and I appreciate you very much. This conversation always gets me to relive my past and keep moving forward. So I do appreciate it. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
You're very welcome. So tell the people, where do they find Where Are My Toys and how they may reach out, connect with you. You never know. Somebody might want to have you on their podcast, or there could be other speaking engagement, or, attending a school to give a talk. You never know what might come out of this.
Yes, you can go to my website at whereareallmytoys.org, just like it sounds. No question mark at the end of Where Are All My Toys. It's just one word, whereareallmytoys.org. They could, see some of the things I've been involved in, some of the influence that the book has had, other newspaper articles, things like that, and they can purchase the book if they'd like from that website. And I'm constantly updating it, so that's a good way to dive deeper into it.
Very good. Very good. Thank you so much, sir. I know we've spent almost an hour and a half together, but this was so rich, and I think a lot of people will find so much value in it. Thank you for sharing your time and your story with us.
Thank you so much.